Hi, welcome back, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Wandering to Wellbeing Self-Care Basic Habits. It's a pleasure to be part of Team Bath's Staying Workout Activity Timetable. And I'm joined today by Aurea Fellows, who is an occupational psychologist and nutritional therapist. And I'm Keith Goddard, who's an occupational psychologist and sport and exercise psychologist. In this session, in this episode, we're going to look at physical well-being as part of our 5 pillars. And particularly we're going to look at is a physical environment and how that contributes to our well-being. And we'll have a little bit of physical activity as well in there. So I'm going to hand over to Aurea now, who's going to kick us off with some top tips.
Thanks, Keith. So in terms of physical well-being, at the moment, obviously, we've got a lot of changes in terms of physically what's available to us and our environment. So it's really important that we think about the constraints that we're currently working with, but also what's changed in terms of how we need to use the space that we have. So one of the things that can be really helpful is to think about creating different zones, either within the house as a whole or within different rooms, depending on the space that you've got. So thinking about all the different ways that we might need to use the space that we have. So all the normal things we do at home in terms of sort of leisure time and sleeping and eating. But now we're also having to include zones for things like home working or homeschooling, maybe thinking a bit more carefully about what we might want in terms of personal space as well as shared family space. And you might have to get creative with this, think about perhaps moving some furniture around to create different zones within a room, or maybe even just marking the floor in some way, moving some ornaments, just so that you can identify the way in which you want to use different aspects of your physical environment for all the different activities that you need to get done. And if you've got shared space, particularly if you've got a lot of people, perhaps more so at home than would be normal for you, it's a good idea to think about some kind of booking system so that lots of people and all those that need to can use the space for the different things that they need to at the times that's right for them. And that's one way that you can also help to create a bit more of a schedule and a feeling of routine around things like homeschooling and home working. And you may need to also think about some signage as well, something to indicate when a space is being used by whom and whether someone's disturbable or not. So my husband and I are both working at home all the time at the moment, and we're lucky enough to be able to have 2 different rooms that we can have one each. And the little kind of signal that we've developed is just the door close. So if the door is closed, I'm sorry, I'm busy, I'm not interruptible. If the door's open, you can come in, you can grab me if you need to. You can certainly offer me a nice cup of tea. The other way that we can think about using our physical space to get some of that routine and that structure is also by the way we move through the space and in and out of the space. So if you're used to going out of the house to go to work, we can replicate that with some kind of a commute for ourselves, either just going out the door, down the corridor and back if we're in a flat, or perhaps out into the garden, round the garden and back in again at the beginning and the end of the day, to physically signal to our brain that we're having a switch in activity. And those sorts of things can also help just to bed in some of those rituals and those routines that we would normally have peppered through the day to help indicate to us that we're moving from one thing to another. So if you normally go out of the office to grab some lunch, you might be able to think about structuring a day so you can actually go out for a short walk before you have lunch, again, to signal to the brain what's going on. So as well as thinking about structuring the environment and the way we're using that physically to help our well-being, we also need to think about not just sort of what we're doing where, but also how we're moving physically. And Keith's going to talk a little bit more about the kind of habits that can be helpful for us in that territory.
Thank you very much, Aurea, for that. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking around our physical activity rather than the environment, but trying to combine the structure and the timing aspect that Aurea's talked about, as well as what we could be doing to maintain our physical well-being, because both the environment and our physical activity are both important to us. One of the things to think about is how static we are And we know before all of this happened, office workers particularly would sit behind desks for too long. So one of the things to try and think about within your zones and your timings that you're trying to establish during the day is the habit of moving, and moving more regularly and standing up more. And we know actually at the moment, more and more people are spending more time behind screens and doing more Zoom time, more FaceTime, whether that be work or social. So therefore, generally, we're sitting down more and more. So I think one of the habits I've developed is in the space I've got is to have a sitting place like I am now, and then in front of me, I've got a set of boxes which I stand up against and put that on. So when I'm doing meetings, what I'm trying to do is I'll sit down for one, stand up for one, sit down for one, etc. And within that, what I'm trying to do is to move around a little bit as well. So the 45-15 recharge aspect, I use that to actually move my location around my meeting. So I'll literally get up, walk around, even if it's in the same space. If I've got time, is to stick my head out the door, walk around the garden, etc. So what you're trying to do is to structure around your physical environment elements of moving, walking, and standing. I think within that as well is stretching. So again, all the sciences there are around actually how important stretching is for us physically, and actually the fact if we're sitting down more, we're not only not stretching, but actually we're doing things that are counter to our physical well-being as a result of sitting in the same position. So one of the habits I've tried to get into is during my days just peppering my day with stretching exercises. I run quite a lot, and one of the things I've noticed is I'm getting more injuries and I'm more injury prone as a result of sitting down more and not stretching. Outside of this, I would be moving around cities, towns, working with different people. I'd be walking quite a lot, walking upstairs, walk up the escalators. I'm just not doing that at the moment. So as a result of that, my exercise is getting affected. So I'm actively having to think about doing little stretching exercises during the day to help me maintain my physical activity, but my physical well-being as well. And that hopefully is helped me to stay fit and healthy, and mean that I can run. I think sometimes as well as just thinking about within your space and your zones is what things can you do where. So some people like yoga, some people like Pilates, stretching exercises, strength-based exercises. So one of the things to think about is actually, as Aurea said, is having zones for different things and doing combinations. And it sounds strange, but actually psychologically that helps you as well to do something specific in a specific place and at a specific time as well, if you can. And trying to do bite-sized chunks as well. I think one of the things to think about is to think about physical activity different to exercise, and to think about actually how we might be able to mix that up. So some people love doing exercise, will be getting out there doing that, whether it be brisk walking, whether it be running, whether it be cycling, all sorts of things that people might want to do. Physical activity is different to exercise because it's less planned, less scheduled, and doesn't necessarily have an intensity to it. And we talked a little bit about moving, stretching, but I think part of it within the exercise is to think about a few things: the intensity you do it at, the type of exercise, and the time you do it at, and the time you do it for. So again, what you're trying to do is to mix it up so it helps you psychologically as well as physically. A lot of people that be watching this and listening to this, I would imagine, would be into their exercise. So I'm not going to talk too much about different intensity, but what we know in terms of the benefits of physical activity is the intensity level. So moderate and intense exercise we know is both good for us physically, but also is good for us psychologically. So one of the things to think about is to pepper your day with different times and different intensities. So for your 1 hour, you may choose to do a moderate walk, moderate cycle. You may choose to split that up, do some intense stuff. But what we know from a combination of physical activity, health, and psychological well-being is if you do 10 minutes of intense physical activity regularly, that helps us with our anxiety and our general psychological well-being. So try and pepper your day with that. And again, doing that 10 minutes occasionally in your 45, 15 minutes actually is rejuvenating as well. So we know actually moderate to intense exercise in short bursts gives us energy. So that's useful as well. I think the other thing to think about as well is to mix up various things across your day, not just physical activity, but build it into other activities. It sounds strange, but when you're cooking, what can you do from a physical activity perspective? So sounds strange. I stand on one leg quite often just to actually help me with my balance, my proprioception, which in turn helps me with my running. So when I'm cooking, my daughter comes in and calls me the flamingo, standing on one leg when I'm stirring the chili, something like that. I think the other thing is always talked about in terms of structure and time in the environment. I try and have things in place at a particular time and in a particular location to help me remember. So I do press-ups before I get in the shower in the morning. So my brain is conditioned to, before I get in the shower, I won't tell you how many I do, but I do a number of press-ups before I get up. And that's part of my strength-based training during the day. The problem is I don't often get a shower every morning, hopefully most mornings. So the interesting thing I've noticed is that I don't do my press-ups if I don't have a shower. So I try and actually make sure that I've got a list or a post-it note somewhere to tell me about that. Again, I think it's with physical activity, sometimes just short bursts of things like Pilates, yoga, and 5 minute bites. If those are your things, is to pepper them during the day. Rather than trying to do a big session, is pick one activity that you can do for 5 or 10 minutes. Do it in the kitchen while you're cooking. You can do some things while you're actually working, while you're sat down, or when you're standing up. As I said, if you move your position into a standing position rather than sitting while you're working, you can do some activities there. I think the key thing is trying to think about piggybacking and building physical activity around other things that you're doing, not additionally to, even though that's important. Because the reality is at the moment, we're all crowded for time and we're trying to crowd a lot of things into our day. So adding extra physical activity, extra exercise may not be doable. Think about piggybacking. So for me, just some top tips to try and incorporate physical activity into your physical environment. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Aurea, who's going to talk about how we can enrich our physical environment.
Absolutely. Going to talk a little bit more about how we can make our environment a bit more multisensory for ourselves to support the different activities and the zoning that I described earlier. So not just how an environment looks, but also how it feels, how it smells, how it sounds, are all things that will help to cue us in terms of what it is that we are trying to do most in that environment. So if we think about the difference between work and leisure and how you might help yourself if you're working from home at the moment to differentiate between those different activities, it might be something as relatively straightforward as thinking about the type of chair that you sit on. So maybe in your work environment, having a chair that feels very different to the kind of chair that you're going to sit in when you relax for your leisure time. There might be things in your workspace that are just cues that it's about time to work. Could be something, again, relatively straightforward, like a particular coffee cup that's your work mug. Or it might be things that you'll normally see on your desk at work, the cues to different activities that you might want to replicate in your home work environment. And when it comes to sounds, it might be thinking about whether or not having something like the TV or radio or the music on or off is a way of signaling to you and to others how the space is being used, what the activity is that you're engaged with at the moment. So the key thing is just to think about our space in a very multisensory way to support those different activities. Then the final thing we wanted to just touch on in this episode today is also the importance of green space. So I'm sure you're probably aware, lots of research out there just about how beneficial it is to our well-being to be out in green space, the physiological response that we have in terms of things like lowering our blood pressure and lowering levels of stress hormones in the body. But I know it's tricky at the moment, for some people more than others, So it's about planning and seeing what you can do in the constraints that you're working with to get out in green space when it's feasible and possible, and thinking about how you can do that. And then when you're out, it's also just not physically being out, either going for a walk or a run or a bike ride, but also trying to engage all of our senses to get the most out of that environment. So again, what do we see? What do we smell? What do we hear? If it's safe, you know, what are we feeling? What's the touch? So being really engaged with the environment, and you know, maybe right now looking at the change of season as a way to sort of really absorb ourselves and our senses in what we're experiencing in that outdoor physical environment. But because that's very restricted for us at the moment, we can also think about bringing the outside inside as well. And here's where we can get super creative in terms of whatever works for us. So we've got things in our technology like screensavers and virtual backgrounds. We could also use pictures and photos to bring the outside inside. We might want to do it with plants, with planting some herbs. Right now I've got a range of herbs sat on my kitchen side, some of which I planted, some which I've bought at the supermarket, just to have a little bit more greenery inside the house at the moment. You might want to even paint a wall green, do a mural of a nature scene. If you've got kids, maybe it's a collage with lots of things of different textures from nature that you could put together. So you can really just let your mind run away with this in terms of whatever's relevant. And don't forget also, we can bring in movies, we can bring in sounds that remind us of a green environment as well, that can all just help to really help us to make that connection with that outdoor physical space that at the moment we're not able to connect with in the way that we normally would. And as Keith said, you know, we've got to think about what's feasible for us right now. We've got to think about what we can control. So pick the things that are relevant for you. And in the time that you have in your recharges, think about the variety of physical activity, movement, and zoning that's going to help to support your well-being right now, and for you to do all the things that you need to do at a very challenging time. So we hope that those top tips around physical well-being have been useful and helpful. Again, just a quick reminder that it's not just about one thing when it comes to well-being. It really is a symbiotic system. So if we can do things to support our physical well-being, we'll also find that paying off in terms of other types of well-being, like our mental and our emotional well-being as well. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been great to have you. Don't forget to do what you can to recharge yourself during the day, to stay safe, to stay well. And we very much look forward to seeing you again soon. But this is goodbye from both of us for now.